Hello everyone, Jonathan here once more. Now the great thing about this series, well, and other things that I do in my day job, is that I get to wander into the collection and discover sometimes, or rediscover things I've looked at and gone, oh, that's cool, I'd love to come back one day and learn more about that. Well, that's exactly what's happened this time, because we have this utterly bizarre looking contraption. Let me immediately show you just how thin this thing is. It's flat as a pancake. Now, one row of barrels, 5 barrels. They are rifled. Probably can't show you that. The grooves are pretty tiny. So the potential for a bit of close range precision, if that's not a contradiction in terms. And as you can see, the barrels are stacked one above the other. Now, there isn't very much on this thing at all. We've got the usual proof marks. Don't necessarily need to see those in detail. They're the standard gunmaker's proof and view marks for the London Proof House. They're on each of the barrels because they all have to be proved. Only other markings on here, well, the barrels themselves are numbered, I guess to help you keep track of which ones you've loaded, which ones you've fired potentially, although I'm not sure how that would help. We'll see in a minute when we operate the mechanism. But the key thing here really is we have Jones patent fairly crudely stamped on this side plate here, which I'll pop off in a moment so we can get a better idea of how this thing works. So the Jones in question, or Joneses, are Richard Jones and Charles John Jones. I don't know if those are father and son, or a pair of brothers, or if it's some weird coincidence that in Ipswich there were 2 guys with the same surname who both were engineers and both wanted to design a gun. I suspect not. This sounds very much like a family business, and I guess if we did a bit more sort of non-firearms research, we might find an engineering firm by the name of Jones operating in 1853 that would have been the guys responsible for this. But at least we know their names. That comes from the patent. Lewis Winant, who is a noted arms and armour researcher, his book Firearms Curiosa, which is well worth picking up if you ever see it in an antique bookshop or something, full of crazy stuff. The first place I saw the helmet gun with the cannon barrel sticking out of the front was in that book. And there's a version of this Jones patent pistol in his book as well, but it's different. It looks more conventional, bit of wood, well, implied sort of wood grips, different shaped trigger guard. It looks more traditional, except for the wacky stuff that's going on that we're going to look at in a second. And it has 2 rows of barrels. And there's one other that I found in an online search that's come out of the woodwork somewhere, exactly the same as the patent, just like the one in Winant's book. And both of those have twin rows of barrels. This one goes for, I guess, concealed carry over firepower. 5 shots, not a huge amount of firepower by 1853, which is when these guys lodged their patent. I suppose I should show you the other side of this thing, although there is precious little to see on the other side. It's basically just flat steel, although we do have this feature here that's attached. It's a separate component, and that forms half of your rear sight assembly, which is quite important. I don't know if we can get a view down the sights for you there, but we'll try. So there's a tiny little blade foresight, appears to be forged into the barrel cluster, and then a channel at the rear as a rear sight. Now these sights are offset. Ergonomically, there's no particular reason to do that, but mechanically there's every reason, because as you can start to see from this arrangement here, we have a huge cavity on the side of the gun. Now that's essential to how it operates, and that's bumped our sight assembly over to the right-hand side so that this hammer can do its thing. Now, this is becoming a bit of a tease, but before we get to the fun mechanism here, I do want to show you the safety. So it's a similar principle to the M1 Garand and the EM2 for that matter, a couple of other designs, in that the safety is in the trigger guard, which means, well, primarily, you can feel it. You can feel when the gun is unsafe. If you go to fire it, you'll know immediately that it's not ready to fire. But in this case, it's a sort of a flag, and it just pivots out of the way to the left for a right-hander, otherwise it's going to be in your way. There's a little flat spring inside the trigger guard that retains it in the center position on safe, and all that does is bar the trigger, and our hammer here, just to preempt what you're about to see with the mechanism, can't cock, so you can't cock it, and you cannot physically pull the trigger, of course, it's physically barred. So that's the safety. We'll move that out of the way because we're going to show you how this thing works. So I like to think of this as a slinky style mechanism, in that you start at the top of the stairs to pull it forward onto, I don't know if you can see it there, this effectively a sear, but the sear is operating, or the nose of the hammer is operating on an external sear effectively, for those of you who understand how these mechanisms work. So I'm going to have to protect the mechanism by putting my finger under the hammer. We don't want it dropping with full force onto these nipples, because if you work hard on these enough by hitting them repeatedly, they will break. That said, the spring is quite weak, but I still don't want to dry fire it. So forgive me for putting my finger in the way, but when I pull the trigger with my thumb, you'll see it will drop off the top step onto the next step. That would, in theory, fire our top barrel. Pull the trigger again, it drags it off the next notch, onto the next nipple to fire the next percussion cap, and therefore the barrel, or the next step, if you in my silly analogy. And then you pull the trigger again, and it goes again, and again, and then down to the last one. So it's like the hammer is tumbling down the stairs, firing a barrel each time it drops. Now, in reality, I did carefully try this out with some percussion caps, and I got one to go to go off, and it split the cap. Otherwise, I was going to put some inert caps on here to show you how it worked properly, but it's not. They either don't work at all, and it gets all jammed up, or the cap does go and splits, and yeah, we don't want to mess with that. So hence I'm assisting it down the stairs. So a completely unique mechanism. As I say, it's in that patent. There's a differences stylistically with this versus the patent and the other one that or maybe two that we've seen out there. The last thing we can do here is to pop off this side plate to give you a bit of an idea of how this descending mechanism is working. Right, just popped off these three screws. Didn't want to bore you with that. Now I say a side plate, it's more of the whole of the side of the grip. So if we gently prise this up. Now what we must do is try to leave the trigger in place. There we go. So the trigger guard comes with it. This is quite interesting in itself, actually. You can see that this almost has the air of a single piece of forged steel. Obviously it's not. It's actually sheet metal. The barrels are forged steel, the hammer, other internal components, but the receiver, if you like, or the frame, is sheet steel. And you can see that here. It's quite rough inside. Doesn't need to be nicely finished. Relatively thin, but strong where it needs to be, I suppose. You'll notice here we've got a pivoting component. Now that is to help guide the hammer. So the body of the hammer sits in this notch here. And as this mechanism climbs the stairs, as it were, this piece rotates with it. But apart from that, everything we need to see is still on the gun. So the trigger's at the bottom, obviously. I'll just pop that back into place. And it's acting against, as triggers usually do, a trigger spring. So we have a little trigger spring at the back there. Simple. Now what's not simple are we have two little horns on top of the trigger and ratchet teeth on this piece above. Now I can't simulate this for you with the side plate off because the side plate is critical to how this operates. You haven't got the resistance to pull the hammer up and forwards without the side plate being on. I could try to do it, but the trigger would drop off and probably other things would come off and you'd be none the wiser anyway. You've seen how it works, up and then down again, one by one, and those ratchet teeth dropping off one at a time, the trigger pulling the hammer backwards off the nipple each time, is quite simply how it works. Great big sort of double mainspring here. Well, it's not really a mainspring. This bit here is the mainspring. This is more of a sort of armature for it, I suppose. And a pivoting arm here so that the whole assembly can move up and forwards with the gun. Now on the patent, there's only one simple traditional mainspring there. So this appears to be a development of it. I don't know why, maybe to make the mainspring stronger, but as I've seen, the mainspring's too weak to reliably set off the caps that I tried it with anyway. And traditionally, 1850s percussion caps are a bit harder than modern ones, at least in our experience. So that's kind of it, really. I just thought you'd like to see under the hood. So the critical thing to remember is the hammer doesn't just go straight up, because then it would miss the nipples entirely. It has to come forwards and sit either on top of a nipple or, in the case of the very uppermost setting, on top of this little external attached plate. That's your starting position. That's the hardest thing to put it up and forwards onto, and it's just ka-dunk, 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 ka-dunk. Fascinating thing. Now, why didn't it catch on? Well, anything complicated like this has history kind of working against it anyway, in terms of cost, practicality. People tend to be quite conservative about things, especially when there are other ways to fire 5 shots quickly. The obvious one being the Colt revolver by 1853, that's well established. But there are other multi-shot firearms are available, notably the British Adams. So this has obviously been invented in the UK, and at that time the Adams was really probably the most successful revolver in the British Isles. This thing is going nowhere. It's got 2 major rivals and probably others as well. But if you want to fire 5 shots in sequence and have a gun that's less than an inch wide, the Jones is your gun. Thanks very much for watching, guys. There are various ways that you can engage with the collection here at the Royal Armouries, this being one of them. You can also head over to the GameSpot YouTube channel for more of me talking about guns. We have our own social media outlets, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. There's our website, of course, our online collection that you can peruse. Most of all, though, we'd very much like you to come and visit us at one of our 3 sites here in the UK, up here at Leeds, down at Fort Nelson on the south coast, or indeed at the famous Tower of London, where all of the arms and armour you can see there are ours, which is nice. So we'll see you again next time.